Hello, my name is Gregg, and I am the Director of Research of the Acton Institute. It's my pleasure to be with you today, and the subject for our discussion, of course, is Christian culture and liberty. I think when it comes to the subject of Christian culture and liberty, we need to be very clear about what we mean by particular words. So when I use phrases like culture, for example, I'm not talking about things like the food which people eat, or the music, or even the language, although those things are, of course, very important when it comes to a subject like culture. By culture, I mean a fundamental way of looking at the world, a way of looking at the world that shapes our choices, which shapes our actions, and which therefore shapes our institutions and the way that we do things in everyday life within a particular setting. Sometimes it's a national setting, sometimes it's a local setting, sometimes it's within a religious or civilizational setting. So when we talk about Christian culture, we're talking about a way of thinking, looking, choosing, and reflecting upon the world, other people, and how they make choices, and how they think, and how they act. So when it comes to a subject like Christian culture, on one level, of course, we're talking about a historical view, that Christianity is very much interwoven into the history of what's called Western civilization, a civilization that, of course, goes back beyond Christianity per se, and which draws upon the Jewish tradition, the Greek tradition, and the Roman tradition, or more specifically, biblical wisdom, Greek insight and reason, as well as particularly Roman law. And that culture, of course, manifested itself in different European countries in different ways. So it doesn't mean that it somehow results in just one particular cultural setting, but nonetheless there's enough commonality between the ways in which Christian culture reflects in the countries of Western Europe or Eastern Europe, of North America and South America, for us to be able to say that there is such a thing as Christian culture. So let me say a little bit more about what I mean by Christian culture. I think one of the most important things we need to realize is that there is a commitment to faith. And by faith I don't mean a blind adherence to any particular position. I mean a faith that certain promises have been made to humanity by virtue of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, and that those promises have been made real, and that they are being transmitted to us today through things like revelation, and revelation in the form of scripture, in the form of church tradition, as well as the lives and writings of saints and doctors of the church, not to mention church councils, as well as pronouncements of bishops and, of course, the Roman magisterium. Another dimension of Christian culture is, of course, its tremendous respect for human reason. Now, this matters because not all religions have the same degree of respect for reason. Even within Christianity itself, I think it's true to say that not every expression of Christianity has the same degree of commitment or even understanding of the nature of reason. I think it's fair to say that within the Roman Catholic tradition we find the most explicit and most systematic appreciation of reason, both in terms of formal logic, or the way that we reason about the world, but also in terms of a commitment to natural law. And natural law, as St. Paul tells us in the letter to Romans, is nothing more and nothing less than the law of God that's written onto the human intellect itself. Paul uses the phrase heart, the heart of the Gentiles, but what he's talking about really is the way that even those people who are not Christian, or who he calls the Gentiles, can still nonetheless know what is right and what is wrong. Moreover, under the power of unaided reason, they can also come to know what is true in the fullest sense, which of course is God, who is fully true, fully good, and fully beautiful. And this appreciation for reason, of course, was worked out over the centuries. We find it in the Church Fathers, particularly in people like Augustine, as well as individuals such as Maximus the Confessor. But it reaches its apogee, if you might say, in the High Middle Ages in the writings of St. Thomas Aquinas. There's a reason why he was called the angelic doctor, because in his work we find not just obviously a deep appreciation and explication of the insights of Christian revelation, we also find in that very same work, particularly his Summa Theologiae, a deep appreciation for reason and natural law, which of course is integrated into the demands and insights of Christian faith. And this is also very important because natural law itself doesn't say that you have to be a believer in God to accept the truths that human reason can in fact identify among other human beings in the natural world, but also in the moral and social order. Now, this appreciation for reason is also reflected in the Christian tradition's appreciation of Roman law. And when I talk about that, what I mean is that Roman law is not this arbitrarily put together collection of random thoughts by different Roman lawyers and thinkers, both during the Roman Republic and after the Roman Republic and during the period of the Caesars and even including up to the end of the Byzantine Empire. Roman law is very, very heavily focused upon the explication of what natural law tells us about the truth of things. It doesn't use the phrase natural law as much as, say, for example, St. Thomas Aquinas does, but it does have this tremendous respect for reason. It also embodies this notion of the jus gentium. The jus gentium is the law that is recognized by all peoples, all legal systems throughout the world, and which emerges, if you like, from below as a consequence of lawyers and judges applying their reason to thinking about any number of questions that require the attention of law. Philosophically speaking, it's heavily influenced by Stoical thought as well as the writings of people like Cicero. And that, of course, makes it very amenable to the natural law tradition, which has been so heavily emphasized by Christian churches and ecclesial communities, particularly the Roman Catholic Church. Of course, culture is historically conditioned, and I think it's very important to remember that over time, cultures change, they develop, they even, you might say, evolve in a certain sense. Cultures really can't be planned from the top down, they tend to move from the bottom up. They're also heavily influenced by the thoughts of those people who are the primary shapers of what might be called the cultural consensus at a particular period of time. And sometimes cultures can change very radically and very suddenly. Cultures that have been in place for a very long period of time can suddenly change in ways that reflect a fundamental departure from some of the preceding principles that informed that particular culture. It's evident, I think, that in much of the West today, what we see, not just in Western Europe, but also in North America, and one must say in Central and South America as well, a gradual shifting away from some of the fundamental suppositions of Christian culture. So, for example, the idea of God is reduced to either a deistic creator who simply winds up the universe and then simply lets it unwind, or God is simply written out of the picture altogether. We also see, going along with that, a declining attention to reason and to natural law, to the point whereby even many Christians do not know what natural law is and would not recognize it if it was explained to them in any brief or even a particularly long, coherent way. That's a major shift for Western culture in the sense that it's not just obviously a departure from Christianity, at least classical Christianity. It also marks a departure from the world of Greece and Rome, and even to a certain extent from the wisdom tradition that's contained within Judaism. Other departures from Western Christian civilization involve issues such as how we understand the nature of the person. In Christian culture, the human person is seen as an amalgam, a seamless amalgam of body and intellect, what you might call spirit. That's simply what Christianity has always called the soul, the seamless amalgam of spirit and flesh. that exists as one entity and never as anything else but one entity. Today, instead, however, we see things such as the emergence of dualism, or dualism as Americans like to say, whereby the mind and body is radically shifted and separated from one another, and we end up in a Cartesian world whereby the intellect is somehow almost like the driver of a car. The driver of a car is not integrated into the car. The driver of the car simply tells the car what to do, whereas the Christian conception of the mind is that it's seamlessly integrated into our physical existence. It's part of our very corporality itself. Another departure, of course, one must say from Christian culture is the idea that there are men and that there are women, and that this is primarily determined by the fact that we are made as different, albeit complementary. Today, however, we see the emergence of gender theory, whereby what we are, be it a man or a woman, is no longer determined by our physicality and our mutual complementarity as sexes. Rather, our gender is really whatever we want it to be, whereby I as a man can say, well, I want to be a woman, so therefore I am a woman and everyone else must recognize me as a woman. Another departure, I think, which is very significant when it comes to Christian culture is the emergence of positivism and utilitarianism as the primary reference points for law rather than the natural law, or even the corpus of law that was inherited and developed by Christian civilization. Now what we find is that increasingly legal judgments are not made with reference to eternal principles that can be known at all times, or even whether they're expressed in civil law systems or whether they're expressed in common law systems. Instead, what we find very much is the idea that law is whatever the state determines law to be. And whatever the state determines law to be is unappealable. One cannot look to divine law or natural law to say that this feature of positive law is illegitimate or it's not really law at all. Now this, of course, is very significant because I think it opens up the road to tyranny, because if there is nothing above the state, if there's nothing above the law as promulgated by governments and legislatures throughout the world, then I think it's very hard to say anything when one is confronted by a law that is obviously unjust, such as laws that identify one particular people of a particular race or a particular religion, for example, as not being quite human, or not being as human or as possessing as much dignity as the rest of us because of their skin color, or because of their religion, or because they're disabled, for example. And this opens up the door for law to no longer protect human liberty, but instead to be a means by which human liberty slowly becomes undermined. Now, we're at the subject of liberty, which I think is inevitably part of any discussion of Christian culture, because Christian culture takes human liberty very seriously. It does so in two senses. One is it holds out the idea that one is made free in Christ. And that was originally understood as freedom from the old Jewish law, and there's certainly a certain degree of truth to that. But it also means a call to a deeper freedom, because being beings who have, or being human beings who have minds, who have intellect, and who have the capacity to make free choices, our liberty is not somehow separate from those sorts of things. Our liberty is not somehow separated out from our capacity and the capacity of our reason to recognize what is true and good and right in all circumstances, as opposed to other conditions. So, for example, if I use my liberty to simply do whatever I want, then I'm not acting reasonably. If, however, I use my freedom in ways that tells me that this course of action is right because it is true and good and doesn't violate the moral law, as opposed to an action or a choice which does violate the moral law, or which in a certain sense leads me in the direction of unfreedom, then I can say that freedom is not simply my capacity to choose between X and Y, or A and B. Instead, freedom is fully realized when I freely exercise my choice to choose good rather than evil, or to choose the right rather than wrong, or to choose the beautiful over the ugly. To give you a very practical example of the problems you run into when you separate reason from free will, as well as from our choices and our liberty, it means, for example, that someone who does something that's outrageously evil can be said to be not behaving under the guidance of reason, that they're not making truly free choices. Now, that's why in most legal systems there's a capacity for people to enter a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. We don't hold insane people responsible for their actions, which, albeit free, are not responsible, precisely because their reason is impaired. So that's a very practical example of how once you take reason out of the picture and our capacity to know truth, which has always been affirmed by Christian culture and Christian tradition, then free will becomes arbitrariness. It becomes simply the capacity to make choices that in the end don't really matter, because all that matters is the fact that I'm making a particular choice. So that's the negative side, I think, of what we're facing now when Christian culture starts to become diluted. Coherent understandings of the nature of freedom also become very difficult to understand. But the good side, I think, of Christian culture when it comes to its relationship with liberty is that it provides a means for structuring liberty, not just in terms of the way that we make choices in our daily relationships, in our own personal decisions about which course of action to take. It also forces us to recognize that institutionally, Christian culture has provided a great deal when it comes to how we build a society that is based upon what I like to call, in the title of one of my books, unordered liberty. A liberty that's not just ordered in terms of each person's reason and the ability of their reason to direct their will in the direction of the good rather than evil, but also in terms of our institutional structures. We have courts of law, for example, because we believe it's reasonable for disputes between people to be worked out in settings whereby we can make just assessments of the rights and wrongs of a particular act or choice, or even a particular situation. We have limited government and we have separated government because we want to make sure, and our reason tells us this, and Christianity, of course, is very much at the root of what we call the separation of powers, because we don't want too much power being concentrated in too few hands. We also want to divide power so that, one, we have more people participating in the ordering of a society that takes liberty seriously, but also because we recognize that it's generally not prudent to put too much power in the hands of any one arm of government, let alone one particular problem. And that's why we have constitutions. Constitutions are an act of reason, in a sense, that is applied to practical circumstances of a given country or nation, in which we try and discern how we will work out in a reasonable way what a direction a society or nation should take, rather than leaving it up to just simply people's individual preferences, because that would mean you couldn't have a society or a nation in the first place. But we also do it because we want people to participate in the process as much as possible. And I think this is another way in which Christian culture has distinctly shaped the tradition of liberty in the West. It recognizes that human beings have reason, that we have free will, which means that we are encouraged as far as possible to participate in politics and decisions affecting the polity, but also because Christianity recognizes that human beings are sinful. We know, for example, reason itself also tells us this, that we are flawed creatures, that we are fallible creatures, that our eyes and our reason are often darkened by the effects of sin. And what that means, of course, is that we need to be very careful when it comes to the subject of power. Because we often talk, for example, about the excesses of too much power being concentrated in particular businesses in a given economy. And that can be a problem. But we rarely think about this issue of power and excessive power when it comes to government and the states. I think there's often a presumption that government officials and bureaucrats are somehow free of sin, are somehow almost angelic beings who simply have a type of all-knowing power and knowledge that enables them to simply go ahead and do the right thing all the time. Well, government officials, state officials, are just as susceptible to the inclinations of sin, what Catholicism calls original sin, as any other person. So Christian culture, I think, when it comes to the subject of liberty, recognizes the fact that we are fallen beings, and is focused on this issue, particularly when it comes to issues of separation of power, of issues of rule of law, of trying to make sure that government officials, be they politicians or appointed bureaucrats, simply can't do whatever they want. It also points to a basic Christian drive to limit the extent of government power, whether it's expressed through the legislature, the executive, or the judiciary, precisely because the people occupying those positions can't be relied upon to do the right thing all the time. They're just as flawed as the rest of us. So those, I think, in summary, are some of the major characteristics of Christian culture, why it's important and why it's significant to the development of the West in particular, but also as a consequence the rest of the world, and how it relates to the subject of human freedom. In fact, I would argue that it's very difficult to build up a rich and coherent understanding of human freedom without this background of Christian culture. In fact, there are plenty of agnostics and atheists who will say quite openly that the tradition of liberty that we find in the West, whether the West we're talking about is in Europe, in North America, in countries like Australia, or in the British Commonwealth, or in Latin America, without this tradition of Christian culture in the background, understanding the benefits of liberty and the reasons why we need to live in a society of ordered liberty rather than anarchy would be very difficult to understand. Thank you very much, and I wish you the best for your event.